This video is about the great new way to combine live-action sRGB footage with Filmic CGI renders in Blender, using a new feature found in Blender 3.3. This new feature has a variety of useful applications, such as adding Filmic CG elements to sRGB tracked video footage, and using video footage or images on 3D geometry within an otherwise Filmic 3D rendered scene. We'll talk about green screen elements on cards, as well as other uses. Before the release of Blender 3.3, virtually every Blender VFX video tutorial, especially camera tracking tutorials, would tell you to do the same thing. Go to Scene, Color Management, and set the view transform to Standard. But by fixing one problem, this actually causes another. It means you can't take advantage of the benefits of the Filmic view transform. But thanks to this new feature, we now can have the best of both worlds. This new feature has gone largely under the radar, but hopefully more people will start using it soon. I won't be able to go into things too technically, because, to be honest, I don't fully understand all the maths behind Filmic. You're welcome to read more about it from the link in the description. I have an approximate understanding, but I also don't believe you need to know all of the maths in order to use it successfully. Let's open Blender and take a closer look. First, let's assume you wanted to track this scene and add in CGI elements. What most previous tutorials would now say is, look how grey and low contrast it looks, so let's change the view transform to standard to fix this. So let's try that first. We'll go to view transform and choose standard. So yes, at first glance this does appear to have had the desired effect, but we'll come back to this. Next, let's fast forward and pretend you've finished tracking and created some CGI elements too. Please excuse the half-hearted CGI work on this one. It's horrible phone footage combined with even worse VFX. Sorry about that. Now, I've deliberately chosen to make a scene where the advantages of the new feature will be really obvious. To show off the feature, I've made sure this scene has a high dynamic range, with some really bright emissive materials clearly visible directly to the camera. But this does also apply to objects with reflected light, especially if those lights are really bright. Now, we're already in rendered view mode, but I'll render a frame anyway to make this even clearer. The view transform is currently set to standard, remember. Now, I don't know about you, but I think this looks really horrible. It's really clear that the highlights of the CGI elements are totally blocked out. Why? Because the exact colour visible to the camera, from this angle and from this surface, has colour values above 1 in the case of the red and the green channels. But 1 is full brightness, which we can't go above, so that's why it looks solid yellow. Now this is something that Filmic was specifically designed to fix. And if this were instead a purely CGI render, using Filmic here instead of the standard view transform would work perfectly. But if I try to switch back to the Filmic view transform right now, notice that while the CGI elements get lots of their detail back, the camera footage now looks low contrast and grey again. What we'd ideally like to do here is use standard view transform for the camera footage, but use Filmic for the CGI. And while we'll soon see that that's not a perfect solution right out of the box, it's going to give us much more flexibility in the compositor to get the best of both worlds with the CGI tying into the live footage properly. So here's where the new Filmic sRGB feature comes in. It's available in Blender version 3.3, so if you have a previous version, you won't be able to use it, so please go and download it now if you haven't already. So where is this new Filmic sRGB option? Well, you won't find it in the view transform drop-down list. That's because it's been implemented as an input color space. So firstly, and this is important, set the scene's view transform to Filmic if you haven't already done that. Then, in the compositor, as well as in other places too, more on this in a minute, you'll have to apply the Filmic sRGB input color space to any image or video that you want to effectively bypass the Filmic view transform. I say effectively because I think what it actually does is it applies an inverse Filmic calculation to the colours on the image, so that when Filmic is applied to the whole scene, it all then works out and the image looks just as if it had had no transform applied to it at all. But if you've just tracked your footage and rendered, you might be wondering, how do I even do that? How do I find that change to make? There's no colour space option here. Now don't worry, that's just because this is a movie clip node which doesn't have a colour space option, because it's using the information from the data block attached to the video when we imported it into the video clip editor, just before we tracked it. So I can either pop back over to the video clip editor and change it under the footage settings, just here, or I can reload the video directly into the compositor separately using an image node. If you do reload your video footage here, just remember that until you load in your video, it won't show the option for choosing colour space. But as soon as you've loaded the file, it gives you the option to change both the colour space and which frames are used. Whichever of those options you use, just set the colour space of the source footage to Filmic sRGB, and suddenly you'll see that it works. So, you now have Filmic applied to the rendered 3D, but standard applied to the source footage. If that's all the info you need to know now, then feel free to stop watching. However, I have noticed some quirks and things you might want to be aware of, so feel free to keep watching for more useful situations and information, and some tips on how to integrate your renders with your source footage well. I'll also give a little advice on doing things the other way round when you want to include sRGB footage inside a 3D CG scene. Firstly, just some things to be aware of. If you're using the motion tracking tab, you can and should set the colour space for your footage to Filmic sRGB if you're using Filmic as the scene view transform. Also, you absolutely can use the Filmic sRGB colour space for the camera background in the 3D viewport. But I've noticed 3 quirks to be aware of. We'll call them quirks, not bugs, because at least 2 of them might be intentional behaviours, but they're not necessarily all that helpful in this context, so perhaps these can be streamlined in future Blender versions? Who knows? Firstly, and I do appreciate this is a bit pedantic, but you have to remember that in Blender, the whole Filmic view transform only applies in rendered or material preview viewport shading modes, not solid view or wireframe. And I don't think there's any way to override this at the moment. But what that means is that if you set the camera's background image colour space to Filmic sRGB, it looks correct in rendered and material preview modes, but if you go to solid or wireframe, technically you should actually be setting the background image back to the default sRGB if you want it to look right. Otherwise, it's applying the correction calculation unnecessarily, so it ends up blowing out the highlights. This probably isn't a big deal for anyone. I'd probably recommend leaving it set to Filmic sRGB. Just be aware of this quirk if you notice your footage looking weird, and if you do, just think, hang on, am I in solid or wireframe mode? And if yes, that's probably the reason. Nothing to worry about. The second thing, related to the first, and this definitely is just something to be aware of, whenever you change the camera background's colour space setting, just be aware that it will also change the colour space of the footage in the video clip editor where you've been tracking. This will probably most likely happen if you've used the Setup Tracking Scene button. So these 2 things will be linked by default. If you want to make them independent for any reason, just click this number here in the camera settings to make sure it's single user data, and then it'll no longer affect the video clip editor. Finally, and I think this is possibly the only thing that could actually be described as a bug here, or at least in need of improvement, is that if you're working with tracked footage, if you have a camera in the 3D viewport using the camera tracking constraint, then while you're playing the animation in the timeline, if the camera background is currently set to Filmic sRGB, it will always play very slowly, no matter how simple the scene or how powerful your computer is. In fact, it doesn't even need to be in rendered mode. It even does this in solid and wireframe. But the moment you switch it to sRGB, it instantly plays at the speed it should. I'm sure this will be fixed in future versions. Now if you've got this far, and you're in the compositor, you may well be thinking, hang on, now my CGI and the camera footage don't match at all. I've now got low contrast Filmic CGI rendering on top of a more punchy sRGB footage from the camera, which has bleached out highlights. But the render doesn't. They don't match. And you'd be right, so let's look into fixing that. Now bear in mind that what we're about to do involves artistic choice and your own interpretation of the scene. We need to grade these to match in the compositor. But what exactly do we need to do? Surely if we boost contrast and lose the highlights, Aren't we now once again missing the point of Filmic? Well, no, not really. Let me show you what I've noticed from my experiments. It's early days with this new feature, so I'm sure my methods will still have a lot of room for improvement, but first, I feel this method needs a little bit of explanation. Modern digital cameras rarely produce images with the highlights as abruptly clipped as they did a few years ago. Sensors and image processing has improved, so if you're trying to get your CGI renders to match real-world footage, the standard view transform probably isn't the best choice anymore. But straight out of the box, neither is Filmic. Realistically, it's something in between, and the exact steps required to make them match will vary from camera to camera, and sometimes you'll want to deliberately have a bit of artistic input into this process anyway. Before we continue, a quick word about ACEs. Without wanting to make this video infinitely long, if you want to try going down the rabbit hole to the next level, then using ACEs as a workflow may well get you even better results. I've tried it can be successful, but at least for now, it's still quite an undertaking and really probably not worth most people's time. Blender support for ACEs does seem to be changing and improving, however, so that's great news. We might come back to this in the future. If you want to look into ACEs now, I can recommend Inlightvfx and Alfie Vaughan's YouTube channels for instructions. However, if all you're doing is getting straight sRGB footage from your smartphone, compact, or even most DSLRs, it's probably not worth your while using ACEs. Unless you have a very high-end camera with LUT files made for your chosen camera, your chosen picture profile already available, you won't find much benefit, since it relies on having exact lookup tables to convert video footage colors to equivalent linear values. Without that, it provides no benefit, and is especially not really helpful for standard 8-bit footage. However, if you can shoot raw format video, or 10, 12, or even higher bit per channel footage, either in log or another LUT available profile, feel free to investigate ACEs. So back to grading our sRGB and Filmic. Now this, to be honest, is where I am getting a bit out of my depth. It seems there are various different ways to calculate and implement the concept of Filmic on linear data, based on slightly different conversion calculations. I don't know the exact curve used in Blender, but thankfully we don't have to know it exactly in order to get really good results. And before you comment, please keep in mind that the way different cameras interpret light levels varies, and so that will have an effect on exactly how we grade. We're trying to get into the ballpark here, and then tweak from there. What we're essentially trying to do here is apply our own curve to the Filmic render, approximately reversing what Filmic does, but doing so in a very controlled manner so that things look good. So after a number of very unscientific tests and poor attempts to reverse engineer Blender's Filmic curve, here's my suggestion for one possible method of combining sRGB with Filmic in the compositor. You'll have to do your own tests, and I can't emphasize this enough, your results will vary depending on your camera, exposure, picture profiles, and even other factors like lenses. This is not an exact science. Use this guide as a starting point and adjust to your own needs. Here goes. I'm going to work from pre-rendered frames here, but this also works with render layers from an active scene if you prefer. Load up your compositing workspace and bring in your footage and CGI elements. Under the Scene tab, under Color Management, make sure your view transform is set to Filmic, and then double check that the look is set to none. Now set up your nodes as you otherwise would. You can add whatever you want in the usual manner. I've added a few lens glares and flares, but that's not the topic of this video. Now, because I'm trying to demonstrate bright emissive materials in this scene, I've also been using the new Blender 3 Shadow Catcher pass, which is another huge game changer. You can see just what a difference it makes when I toggle it on and off. But that's not the subject for this video. Anyway, what I'd suggest as a starting point is to add an RGB curves node to your CGI. I've got two here because I'm doing a Shadow Catcher pass, but you can ignore that for now, they're identical. In fact, since in this case I've chosen to do exactly the same processing to both passes, I'll put these into a node group so that they're synchronized. The point is, the only thing I'm adding is this curves node and an exposure node just before it. Everything else would be here anyway. Let's quickly tidy this up. Let's jump inside that node group. Now in this scene I found it best to set the curve tone mode to film-like, but a different render I made looked much better with it set to standard. Next, I add a point to the curve. It doesn't really matter where you click at this point, because we're going to type in the values manually. So once you've clicked, simply type 0.6 into both the X and the Y boxes. Then, don't add any more points. Instead, click the end point here in the top right hand corner and type 0.8 for X, and leave Y set to 1. Finally, you shouldn't need to adjust this, but make sure it is set to extend extrapolated, not extend horizontal. You can see what happens if I choose horizontal. It effectively clamps the brightness value at the top point, which can never be more than 1. But what we want is for the invisible part of this curve that extends up in an imaginary way to continue up here, not extend out to the right. And that's it. At least, that's the starting point. I'd especially recommend tweaking the exposure and the X value of this top point to get your desired result. You can also change the midpoint or find some other suitable way of adjusting. Finally, it's a good idea to check, and if necessary adjust, the saturation, black and white points to match your footage, followed by a final grade to achieve your desired look. We're not going to go into this now, because this video is long enough already. Please let me know in the comments if that's something you'd like me to cover in a future tutorial. So, using this Filmic sRGB method, in my opinion, gives considerably better results in most cases. If you have a really low contrast scene with very soft lighting, you might be able to get away with a standard view transform. But if, like me, you've been itching to get better results, feel free to try this method. Okay, so we've talked about adding CGI to video footage, but what about the other way around? What if we want to add video footage, such as green screen, to a Filmic 3D scene? Can this method help here too? Yes, absolutely. Imagine we have this 3D scene here, where this newsreader is on a plane, a card if you will, placed on this quickly constructed 3D environment. Disclaimer, please don't judge this horrendous green screen work. When I made this for a joke video last year, it was all quickly put together during a COVID lockdown, and we didn't have access to a green screen or any lights. All we had was an old teal curtain and a window. Please ignore the content here. I'm just trying to show you a useful application of Filmic sRGB. So as you'll notice in this material node setup, the green screen plane is effectively shadeless. I wanted to approximate the real-world lighting with the lights in the 3D scene, but since this was made prior to Blender 3.3, I had to set the view transform to standard, because if I had set it to Filmic, despite the material being shadeless, this happens, it goes grey. I had to use standard. However, as you'll probably notice, and this wasn't avoidable at the time, lighting in the CGI scene actually makes for some really ugly clipped highlights here on the desk, which isn't what we want. At the time, I didn't worry too much, since it's only just noticeable. I'd already turned down the intensity of the light and moved it slightly further away, so that the light fall off would be more gradual by the time it hit the table, but it's still there. However, what I could have done if I'd had Blender 3.3 is set the scene view transform to Filmic, and in the shader editor, set the input color space to Filmic sRGB. Now you can see we've got the green screen card looking right again, and all we need to do now is grade accordingly in the compositor, just like last time. I'd recommend using 2 view layers to help you separate the green screen elements from the CGI room, so that you can adjust them independently like we showed you earlier.
Not the bag. We're a little hungry. I think your family might be a little bit hungry as well. We can't just have all of it.
Finally, I'll show you a neat little trick where you can actually mix between Filmic and sRGB. Just remember that when you're in Filmic, setting an imported sRGB image to Filmic sRGB bypasses the view transform, and setting it to just sRGB will let Filmic bring it into the Filmic world as if it were part of it. With appropriate shaders, this can be very handy. Here's a little scene where a photo's on a table. The scene view transform is Filmic since it's a high contrast fully CGI scene with a lamp. The photo is an imported image texture as you'd expect. It's set to sRGB, but as the camera approaches it turns into real video footage. The camera then closes in on the photo until it perfectly fills the screen. At this point, we want to be able to cut from the render to the actual video footage. So the geometry and the camera work is done, almost ready to render, but at the moment this video is still being shaded. Let's fix that by going into the shader editor and mixing between the principal shader and a shadeless texture. It works, sort of, but it's still being affected by the Filmic view transform, so we still get a sudden cut from the grey Filmic footage to the unaffected original video at this point. But thanks to Blender 3.3, we can actually fade to the standard unfilmiced version at any point in the render. Simply duplicate this node, then, and this is important, click here to make it a single user data block, then set the color space to Filmic sRGB. Now we can set up a mix shader to mix between the two, and we get the desired result. As you can imagine, this can be quite useful. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Is this new feature a magic bullet to perfectly tied in CGI and video footage? No. It'll definitely still need tweaking every time. And I'd still recommend that you shoot your video with manual settings if possible, locking in your white balance and exposure to avoid the colour and brightness wandering throughout the shot. But this really is a huge improvement. All cameras are different, some capture wider exposure ranges than others. They will all still clip highlights, but being able to render CGI assets in Filmic means the control is now in your hands and you can decide how much to allow the CGI rendered elements to clip in order to match that source footage. The new Filmic sRGB input color space feature is a very welcome, huge improvement over previous methods in my opinion. It's especially useful in scenes with high dynamic range. Blender developers, including Brecht van Lommel, thank you. For no reason at all, I'll leave you with this spinning CGI biscuit.